Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Chapter 1. The Battle with the Tiger. Siraji. The Mohammedan innkeeper, standing in the midst of a group of fellow believers and Indians, approached the young man who had called him, who resembled an Arab, though his face had an unmistakable English type. "Are you sure it was a tiger?" asked the stranger. "Yes, Sidi. I've seen his trail. It is large and sharply drawn. So it must be a female, and may Allah curse it. Almost every day she tears me one of my sheep. I am a poor coffeehouse owner and own only 22 sheep. Can't she go to someone better off?" "Why don't you kill her?" "Kill the female of the yellow tiger? Don't you know that a shaitan lives under her skin and that he tears everyone who wants to harm her?" The young Englishman, laughing, turned to his friend, who lay beside him on a blanket, and in English he spoke to him. "What do you think, Charlie? Shall we take out the shaitan?" "I am gladly willing, Edward," replied the inquirer. The person addressed by the name Charlie was a young man of perhaps 25 years of age. Evidently he was an Englishman, like his friend, who might be in his 30s, and like this, clad in a white burnous, such as the Arabs wear. Both smoked from short earthen pipes and enjoyed the Turkish coffee before them. The inn in which this conversation was held was in a valley surrounded by sheer cliffs. To the east was a narrow pass leading to the caravan road which ran through the desert. The Englishman resumed the conversation and spoke to the innkeeper who stood before him. "But if you don't kill the tiger's female, it will eventually tear you too. She will keep far from my house, though she kills my herd. Whoever prays 3 times a day is safe from all wild animals. I possess something more powerful and which protects me from all enemies. Teach me what it is, O Lord." "I can't teach you, but I want to show you." The Englishman had taken up his rifle, which lay beside him, and aimed it jokingly at the Arab. Startled, he jumped to the side. "Flee, men. The Sige has lost its mind and wants to kill us." Great uproar arose among the few guests of the coffee house. All pushed aside to get out of harm's way. Gaily Lord Lister, for he was the Englishman, cried as he set down his rifle. "Sit still, guys. I don't want to kill any of you, but I will free you from the tiger. Siraj, take me to the place where your sheep are." "But Lord, are you mad? Do you wish that I should go out with you now in the night, and let the beast tear me to pieces?" "Then describe to me the place where your sheep are." "Barely 100 paces from here, to the south, where all those stones are." Lord Lister had risen and raised his rifle. The knife was already in his belt. His friend Charlie also stood up, taking up his rifle. Lord Lister asked the 3 servants who accompanied him, "Which one of you is coming?" All 3 jumped up. Fear was plain on their features. The largest of them, a Mohammedan, stepped forward and, stretching out his arms as if in defense, spoke. "I thank Allah that I have life. You cannot desire, my lord, that I give it to the wild beasts." "So you're scared, Hassan?" In the well-known, florid way of all Eastern peoples, who always fall into exaggeration, he answered. "O Sidi, set me against 100 enemies and Hassan fear not, but fight with a wild beast, never." "Then stay here." "Oh, my lord, do not go either, you are a man whose flesh the beasts are fond of. If you go now, they will tear you apart, and nothing more will be found of you tomorrow but the soles of your shoes." "Don't worry, Hassan, you'll see not only the shoes tomorrow, but the man who wears them. Come on, Charlie." Quickly the two friends left the safe house and continued through the narrow pass. Proceeding closely in a southerly direction, they also soon beheld a mass of high, mighty boulders. The enclosure where the sheep were kept adjoined one of the cliffs. The three other sides were shot by stakes connected by ropes. It was a clear night, so that it was easy to see the contours of the rocky masses. Between two of these rocks there was a chasm at a fair height, the top of which was covered by fallen stones. Thus closed on three sides, this space offered a safe hiding place for hunters. Both friends, before they left the inn, had first laid off the white burnous, which would have been a nuisance to them in their ascent. Nothing disturbed in their movements, they climbed up the rather steep cliffs, and soon they reached the gorge. Lord Lister was the first to enter this chasm. Moving slowly forward, he tried to see what was in the dark space. Charlie Brand had followed his friend and was just descending into the cave when he drew back with a cry of horror. With a furious hissing, a monstrous beast had risen. In the next instant Charlie felt it wrap itself around his right leg, and now the giant serpent's head, tongue outstretched, approached the poor boy's face. It was a tiger snake of the largest kind, which Charlie had disturbed in her sweet rest. Paralyzed with fright, the young man stopped. Behind him the steep rocks, before him the black chasm, perhaps even more terrible, and close to his face the wide-open mouth of the hideous beast with death fangs. Lord Lister had seen at a glance the terrible danger his friend was in. Any moment could be his last. If the monster bit, Charlie was irretrievably lost. In an instant he had turned his rifle around. With great force the butt whizzed past Charlie's head, crushing the serpent's head against the rock face. The body of the reptile, in its last convulsions, curled so tightly around the young man's leg that at any moment he thought he heard the cracking of his bones. The blow had arrived with tremendous force. Quickly Lord Lister had drawn his knife from the girdle and with a single cut severed the half-crushed head from the body of the serpent. The convulsions ceased, and a few moments later the dead body fell to the ground. Charlie could not speak a single word of horror. Half unconscious, he leaned into his friend's arms. "You saved my life," said Charlie at last, exhausted. "But, my dear boy, that's not worth talking about. You'll do the same if necessary. Now let's see what our victim looks like." On closer inspection it turned out to be a tiger snake of 8 meters in length. Lord Lister had taken out his electric flashlight and shone a light into the little cavern to see if there were any more snakes in there. However, these fears were unfounded. The two friends now made themselves as comfortable as possible. Guns in hand, they listened intently to every sound in the silent wilderness. Suddenly there was movement among the sheep. They put their heads together and crept fearfully against the rock wall. Lord Lister leaned forward a little for better sight and hearing. There he heard above him an almost inaudible dragging sound. Apparently the animal had climbed onto the rock to pounce on its prey. The Lord quickly withdrew his head. The tiger's claws could clearly be heard scraping the rocks. Now a leap followed, a dark body swept past the heads of the hunters, a short, bleating death cry echoing from the midst of the frightened flocking sheep, and the tiger stood erect among the terrified beasts. Under his right forepaw lay the slain sheep. The beast of prey now raised its head and uttered its triumphant cries. Anyone who has ever heard these sounds will never forget them. The animal's wide-open, greenish glossy eyes offered a splendid target. Before the roar had died down, a shot rang out through the silent night. With a terrible roar the animal flew up and wanted to jump to the rocky canyon. Before it could reach it, however, it fell to the bottom. The bullet had entered the middle of one eye. Charlie couldn't resist giving his friend a loud "bravo" to invoke. The whole thing had happened so quickly that Charlie, although he had kept his rifle ready, had had no opportunity to fire. The loud bang which had killed the tiger, however, had an entirely unexpected effect. Suddenly a hoarse, savage cry sounded in the distance, followed after a very short time by a furious roar in the vicinity. With great leaps a slender, lithe beast approached, crouching close to the sheep, just opposite the hunters. It was evidently the male tiger, alerted by the death cry of the female, who had rushed forward. To have noticed both of its foes in the rocky canyon, he crouched down with a furious hiss to prepare himself for the leap. Happened so quickly that Lord Lister had not had time to get his gun ready again. He had just reloaded when the animal sprang like an arrow from a bow at the hunters. Both seemed lost now. Another shot rang out, and in that indivisibly brief moment the slender body of the beast was seen moving through the air. Flying overhead, it fell with a loud thud on a jutting boulder at the feet of the two friends. When Charlie realized the danger they were in, he, without thinking for a moment, shot and thus saved himself and his friend from certain death. In his excitement and haste, however, he must not have aimed correctly. The tiger had fallen badly injured, but not dead. A terrible roar rang out. Foam and blood flowed from the wide-open mouth of the beast of prey, and, half erecting itself, the gigantic beast lashed out its claws at its foes. Lord Lister had followed the scene with tense attention. In a feverish haste he had loaded his rifle and now he aimed at the wounded tiger. A shot rang out, the beautiful beast rolled down from the boulder and landed among the sheep, who uttered cries of terror. Though Lord Lister knew no fear, yet a sigh of relief escaped him as he saw the mighty foe fall. Shaking his friend's hand, he said, "You see, Charlie, you've already repaid me for the little service you just gave, for without your help that fellow down here would have played an ugly part." The bold hunters loaded their guns and clambered down onto them. Both predators lay on top of each other. They were enormous and the female in particular was so heavy that it was difficult to move it. The howling of the jackal echoed in the distance. This corpse robber of the desert had followed the tracks of the tigers and now hoped for a delicious meal. When the heroes of this nocturnal adventure re-entered the inn, the guests were still gathered. Curiosity, coupled with fear, had kept them awake. It seemed incredible to them that two men should have dared to hunt such a dreaded beast of prey in the middle of the night. The crack of the shots had told them that a fight was taking place. Of course they thought only that the two overconfident hunters would lose out. People now stared at those who entered like phantoms. "Welcome, gentlemen," spoke the innkeeper. "You have done wisely. We have heard your shots that will also keep the tigers at bay during this night." Lord Lister replied, "The female of the tiger has come with the male and has killed one of your sheep. You must fetch it at once, lest the jackal eat it up, whose cries we have already heard. Allah save me, but let the jackal eat it up. I will not go out where the wild beasts would devour me. You will not be torn apart, for both tigers are dead." "Do you speak the truth, Sidi?" "My word is truth. Come, men, and help to bring in the bodies of the slain." At these words great excitement seized those present. No one would believe that the English gentleman was telling the truth, and it took the two friends some time to persuade them to go along. At last it was decided and torches were lit. Under the leadership of the two heroes, they all set out. The sheep huddled in fear when they saw the flaming torches. The scene that follows is indescribable. No sooner had the Arabs seen the slain beasts than they threw themselves upon the bodies. They beat the now defenseless beasts with their fists, trod upon them with their feet, and heaped upon them with all manner of epithets in which the Oriental peoples are so rich. Then the animals were dragged to the inn and their skins were stripped there. When the two friends had wrapped themselves in their blankets, Charlie spoke. "Raffles is a tiger hunter and snake slayer, that has never happened before." Lord Lister replied only with a merry smile, and then both fell asleep. Chapter 2. A Human Sacrifice. After the little caravan had refreshed itself in the valley with its provisions, Lord Lister gave the order to break up. He himself and his friend Charlie rode horses of the little Barbary breed, beasts that seemed to be indefatigable. The three servants sat on camels, which also carried the luggage. "I don't think we'll reach Mangalore today, Edward. It must be late already." The Lord looked at his watch and replied, "Yes, it is almost 3 o'clock, but if we hurry, we can reach the city before sunset." The mounts were urged on and, enveloped in a dense cloud of dust, the caravan moved on. After half an hour a very dense forest was reached, which seemed to stretch for miles. This road was much more pleasant, for here the riders were not so much affected by the dust. On the other hand, here it was only possible to ride one behind the other, and so the procession moved forward in a winding line. At the head rode Lord Lister. Suddenly he reined in his horse, for from the dark wood came a dull sound and strange metallic sounds became audible. It was like a concert of human voices and brass instruments echoing from afar. John Raffles signaled the caravan to halt. Quickly he had jumped from his horse and a moment later he had worked his way through the dense undergrowth. After a while he came back and said, "It is a procession of Brahmins coming this way. If at all possible, we will avoid being seen by them." The mounts were immediately carried deeper into the forest into a clearing where, by all accounts, they would not be seen by the processioners. This precaution was necessary. For, where the Indians are already generally suspicious and hostile to all foreigners, they may be provoked to unbridled anger when infidels, as they call all men who do not share their faith, spy on them in their religious observances. The main thing now was to prevent the animals from betraying them, because any sound would cost them their lives. With the camels this was relatively easy, as their mouths are always bound shut by the bridle when they are used as mounts. However, it was more difficult with the horses. Each of the riders, therefore, stood close to his mount and held the reins tight as he stroked the animal's neck reassuringly. Meantime the procession of the Brahmins was drawing nearer and nearer. The confused noise of instruments and voices grew louder and louder, monotonous singing mingled with the sound of cymbals and drums. Now the spire of the procession became visible through the trees, scarcely 200 paces away, so that the listeners could see and hear everything. In front walked the priests with mitres on their heads, dressed in long checkered robes. They were surrounded by men, women, and children, who seemed to echo a kind of death song. At regular intervals drum and cymbal beats interrupted this monotonous melody. This group was followed by zebus, which were extraordinarily richly decorated. They pulled a two-wheeled cart, the woodwork of which was decorated with creepy snake bodies. On the cart stood a great figure, which had 4 arms. It was an image of the goddess Kali, the goddess of love and death. The body of this figure was painted bright red. The hair fluttered in confusion over the head, the tongue hung out of the mouth. The lips were smeared with paint. The neck of the goddess Kali hung an ornament of skulls, and around her hips was a girdle of severed hands. She stood on the body of a human giant, whose head had been cut off. Around this figure revolved and swarmed incessantly a multitude of old fakirs, who had painted themselves with ochre stripes, as if they were zebras. The nearly naked bodies of these fanatics were covered with crisscross cuts, from which the blood continually seeped. It was a creepy sight. Some of the fakirs had thrust small daggers and knives through the muscles of their arms and legs, some had 3 or 4 short arrows in the forehead and auricles, so that the blood flowed from the head all over the body. In this state they performed their regular dances around the idol. Behind them some Brahmins, clad in splendid oriental robes, dragged a woman who could scarcely keep her feet. She was still young and of extraordinary beauty. Her head, neck, shoulders, ears, arms, hands, and ankles were laden with jewels, necklaces, bracelets, rings, and chains. A tunic of thin muslin, interwoven with gold, enveloped her figure. Behind this group guards, with white sabers and long pistols in their belts, carried on a bier the corpse of an old man. The head was covered by the turban richly embroidered with pearls. The body was wrapped in a robe of silk and gold, around which was a belt adorned with diamonds. In this girdle stuck the splendid weapons of an Indian king. Bands followed, and the tail of the procession was again formed by fanatics, who occasionally shouted over the noise of the instruments. The long procession moved slowly forward under the trees and was soon lost in the darkness of the forest. Hassan, Lord Leicester's tall Mohammedan servant, had approached them, and now, pointing his hand in the direction in which the procession had gone, spoke. A sutti. Occasionally heard only at a great distance, the servant dared not speak loudly. Lord Leicester asked, "What does the word sutti mean?" "A human sacrifice, Sidi. The woman we saw just now will be burned as soon as possible tomorrow." "And the corpse?" "Is that of her husband, an independent Raja." "What?" exclaimed Charlie in horror. "Do those barbaric customs still exist in the Indies? Couldn't our government put an end to that?" "My dear Charlie," replied Lord Leicester, "in most of India these human sacrifices have ceased to take place, but in these savage regions English law has no influence." "Oh Sidi," exclaimed Hassan, "the whole northern ridge of the Windhia Mountains is the scene of constant murder and atrocities. The sacrificial death, which will take place tomorrow, is also not voluntary." "Why do you think?" "The case is well known in this area. The sacrifices are intoxicated with the smoke of hemp and opium." "Where are they taking that unfortunate woman?" Lord Leicester inquired further. "To the pagoda of Nyagroda, 2 miles from here at the most. There she must pass the night and await the hour of her death." "When will the sacrifice take place?" "Tomorrow at the crack of dawn." The travelers had gone to their mounts to continue on their way. Lord Lister was about to spring into the saddle when suddenly he spoke to his friend Charlie Brand. "What do you think? Shall we save this woman from martyrdom?" Chapter 3. The Spirit of the Raja. The pagoda of Niagara bordered a dense forest at the rear. In a large, open square, which stretched before the idol temple, the participants of the procession, priests, fakirs, men and children, had gathered. In a circular, free space, the fakirs performed their sacred dances. The spectator had to think that he was in a madhouse. The fakirs sprang, twisted, and whirled, amid savage shouts that were supposed to pass for song. With sharp knives in their hands, each did his best to inflict as many wounds on his body as possible. The blood was already flowing in streams. The priests had distributed bhang. This is a liquid that consists of a decoction of hemp mixed with opium. The use of this diabolical mixture causes savage drunkenness, followed by a deep sleep with all sorts of fantastic dreams. The crowd relished at the sight of the blood dripping from the dancing fakirs, and this enthusiasm was aroused to indescribable ferocity by the drinking of the bhang. All were screaming and ranting like mad. The drums and cymbals were worked with great force. In short, it was a hellish spectacle. As the effect of the bhang became noticeable, the witches' Sabbath grew more and more mad, only to diminish afterwards, when all felt the need for rest and sleep. Before the image of the goddess of love and death, who looked down in all her horror upon the savage scene, a funeral pyre had been erected. It consisted of precious sandalwood soaked in fragrant oils. On this funeral pyre lay the corpse of the Raja, to be burned at daybreak with his unhappy widow. The savage clamor had gradually died down. Most of the party-goers lay in a deep sleep, sometimes interrupted by sudden cries, if the dreams were already too stuffy. A few torches insufficiently illuminated the square, which, with the drunken sleepers, presented a disgusting sight. The thick undergrowth of the wood which adjoined the idol temple was gently stirred, and out of the darkness a figure emerged and, prowling cautiously, sought to approach the building. A second figure followed shortly after. It was Lord Lister and his friend, Charlie Brand, who approached the temple. The dark-skinned servants had stayed behind with the mounts, because they could not be counted on in the planned plan, and also because they would have objected to interfering with the sacred customs of their own tribe. And this was not their fault, for, if they were captured, the vengeance would be terrible. The friends had agreed to make an attempt to penetrate the idol temple in the night. Leaving the sheltering darkness of the forest, they carefully slid to the ground, creeping slowly forward on their bellies. When they had covered some distance in this way, they found to their regret that the entrance of the pagoda was guarded by two armed men with white swords in their hands. This twosome did not seem to be under the influence of the bhang, for they paced back and forth, apparently the only sober ones in the party. After withdrawing a little, the friends discussed whether they would dare to attack the guards. Soon, however, they realized that they could not succeed, for it would be impossible to do so without sounding the alarm. And that would be dangerous, for even if those who lay there roaring did not hear anything, the priests, who had to watch all night with the doomed, would perhaps be alerted. The two friends now agreed to enter the temple from the rear. To reach that side of the building without much difficulty. It was almost morning, but everything was still shrouded in darkness. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, so that the danger of being seen was very slight. But now a difficulty arose. The walls of the temple and the stones resisted every attack. With the utmost effort the two friends worked, for, they reasoned, if they could but succeed in working loose a single stone, the others might easily be removed also. However, all efforts were in vain. Meanwhile it was getting later and later, and it seemed to them as if a movement had begun in the square in front of the temple. The first light of the dawning day was already visible. It would be suicide to stay there any longer. So gloomy and disappointed, the two heroes had to abandon their rescue work. They retreated into the undergrowth, and then hurried back to the resting place of their horses. On the way, Lord Lister seemed to have made up his mind, for he immediately had the mounts saddled. Then the servants had to take the camels to a clearing. He himself and Charlie Brand, however, led their little horses close to the temple, where they tied them to trees. The servants had been ordered to prepare for flight at any moment. And more lively in the square in front of the pagoda. The sleepers awoke, drums sounded, savage screams and songs were heard again. The darkness of the night had given way to the light of the coming day. Now the hour had come when the unfortunate woman was to die a terrible martyr's death. The doors of the temple were opened, and a bright light shone from the building. 2 priests dragged the victim out. The young woman had gone into a state of numbness, an effect of the hemp drink. Reluctantly she followed her executioners, who dragged her through the ranks of the fakirs. These had resumed their dances and tortured their bodies with knives and daggers, almost worse than the day before. A deafening noise and savage screams rang out as the sacrifice was dragged into the circle. There stood a large box of glowing coals, in which lay large lumps of iron. A priest approached, took out one of the white-hot pieces of metal with great tongs, and held it before the unfortunate woman, who now had to endure the trial by fire. The cruelty of these Indians is almost limitless. The poor victim is tortured in a terrible way before being given over to death by fire, but the intoxication of the hemp potion is really beneficial here, for the unfortunate creature hardly knows what is happening to him. So it was here too. A second priest seized the young widow's right hand and placed it on the red-hot iron. A hissing noise was heard and the smell of burnt flesh spread in the air. Without uttering a sound, the unfortunate woman had endured this terrible torment, but then she collapsed as if unconscious. Roughly and brutally she was dragged aloft, dragged onto the funeral pyre, and laid beside the corpse of the Raja. A priest took one of the torches, held it to the wood of the pyre, and bright flames sprang from the oil-soaked wood. But, what was that? A terrible scream suddenly sounded. The fakirs, priests, soldiers, and the people, all cried out and fell prostrate, covering their eyes with their hands, lest they, as earthly and unworthy beings, see the holy miracle that was done there. Wasn't the Raja dead? He had been seen to rise suddenly and vanish, like a ghost, with a young woman in his arms from the stake. Lord Lister had come to a desperate decision. He had to save the unfortunate, save at all costs. So he had crept carefully behind the pyre and clambered up on that side. Mindless of his own life, he crouched down when the 2 priests, some distance from him, had laid down the offering. At the moment when the flames burst from the wood, he seized the unconscious woman with a muscular arm and hurried down with his load. Charlie stood close to the horses. He kept his rifle at the ready, if necessary, to protect his friend from imminent danger. When he saw the rescuer climbing down through the flames with the young woman in his arm, he quickly untied the horse's ropes. Swift as lightning, Lord Lister had mounted his Barbary horse and placed the still unconscious widow of the Rajah across the saddle in front of him. Just as deftly, Charlie jumped into his saddle and it went off at lightning speed. All this happened very quickly. When the superstitious fears of the Indians had subsided, they looked up, and now in the flames of the funeral pyre they clearly saw the corpse of the Rajah. Now it became clear to them that this was not a question of a resurrection of the dead, but of the abduction of the widow. A terrible scream rang out. Curses and curses followed the refugees. Crushing the unconscious woman in his arms, John Raffles, followed by Charlie, flew on through the eastern jungles. With wild threats the priests rushed into the woods, the soldiers followed. They saw the robbers at a great distance. The soldiers ducked and the crack of shots echoed through the forest. A bullet struck Lord Lister's hat, proof that the Indians had not badly aimed. Soon, however, the distance between the fugitives and their pursuers increased, the bullets and arrows could no longer reach their target, and the 2 brave heroes with their hard-won loot disappeared from sight. Chapter 4. On the Run. Not far from the coast rises the Malabar Mountains, which, with their wild crevasses and gorges, offer wonderful and romantic natural scenes. In one of these chasms 3 riding camels lay resting, while 2 horses were tied to logs. 2 white men, 3 coloreds, who were the servants of the 2 whites, and a young woman had sought a resting place here. It was the rescuers who had rescued the young widow from death, and their companions. The fugitives had chosen the nearest road to the mountains, hoping that they would be better able to hide themselves in the clefts of the rock should the pursuers discover their trail. Lord Lister's horse had injured its hind leg in the hasty flight and could no longer bear the double burden. They had therefore been forced to take this rest, to make new plans. The widow of the Rajah had already regained some consciousness during the mad ride, and now she had completely recovered from the paralyzing effect of the drink. Lord Lister had bandaged her wounded hand carefully and as required. The rescued woman could not understand her condition at all at first. Where was she? Who were these men? Was she still alive? Thousands of such questions flew through her brain. When she was finally assured of her salvation, her gratitude knew no bounds. She wept hot tears of joy and emotion, but also of concern about her future fate. On request she told that she was a Hindu girl and the daughter of a wealthy merchant in Pune. She had come to Bombay when she was very young, where she had received a good English education. This could also be seen in her, for, according to her manners and culture, one might have taken her for a well-bred Englishwoman. Her name was Kaisa Gotami. Her father, the wealthy merchant of Pune, died and she was given in marriage to the old Raja. But after half a year of marriage she had already become a widow. She had known exactly what terrible fate awaited her as a widow and had therefore fled. She was soon seized, however, and the relatives of the deceased sacrificed her to be burned, because then the great riches of the Raja and the not insignificant dowry which the orphan had brought in marriage would become theirs. Lord Lister inquired where these treasures were, and Kaisa Gotami told that all the Raja's possessions, all the gold, the precious stones, weapons and trinkets, were carried, as always at the burning, in the chariot on which the goddess of love and death enthroned. These treasures were then brought into the temple in which the sacrifice was to spend the last night and dedicated to the god Siwa. How long will the treasure be there? Daylight must shine twice upon the treasure, then it shall be collected by the priests in a splendid procession. The 10th part of the treasure then falls into the hands of the priests of Siwa, the rest to the relatives. Understood. It would, however, be an unspeakable pleasure to me to have the Siwa priests look at their noses. Why should we wait until the treasure is divided? We're going to get it in its entirety. Twice the daylight must shine upon the treasure, so we have until tomorrow night. Kaisa Gotami followed this short conversation with signs of great fear. She understood every word, for she knew English as well as her mother tongue. When Lord Lister fell silent, she spoke with clasped hands and in a pleading tone. "Don't do that, sir. You already risked your life when you saved me, now you want to risk it a second time. Remember, if you are caught, the cruelest martyrdom awaits you. I know those people, they are devilishly cruel in inventing the most terrible torments." But Lord Lister replied in a firm voice. "Don't worry about us. No Brahma priest, no fakir, no one will hurt us. We will go and fetch the treasure and in this way punish the horrible priests and the cruel relatives properly." Kaisa Gotami fell to his knees before Lister and, with hot tears, besought him to abandon his plan. His eyes hung on the beautiful woman. Gently he passed his hand over her head and, raising the kneeling one, said, "I thank you for your concern for our lives, Kaisa Gotami, but we will wrest from the priests their treasure without losing their lives, for your prayer will protect us." With clear words, Lord Lister issued his orders. His plan was to fetch the treasure during the next day, calculating that the people who were searching for the kidnapped woman would then be far enough from the idol temple that no discovery should be feared. They would ride back slowly during the night, and then Kaisa Gotami and the servants would rest while Lord Lister and Charlie would attempt to reach the treasure. So far everything had been agreed. Just as the final preparations for departure were being made, confused noises were heard from the distance. Immediately everything in the small camp was in motion. It was clear to all that perhaps death was imminent there. The sound became stronger and stronger, one could already clearly distinguish some cries and exclamations. Charlie had discovered that it was the procession of priests, fakirs, and folk returning home and, hoping to find the fugitives, searched the mountains. Now the greatest caution was necessary. If a single sound betrayed the presence of the English, they were lost. When the procession was heard approaching, the servants had prostrated themselves to invoke their gods. It was almost impossible for Lord Lister to pacify the people almost mad with fear. Finally, however, he succeeded. Besides, it was high time, for the procession had come so near that one could clearly hear the words that were being spoken. Flight was impossible. One had to wait quietly in the rocky gorge and hope not to be noticed. What the fugitives had to hear about the fate that awaited them if they should be discovered was not able to excite them. Naturally, the talk of the masses turned only to the robbery of Kaisa Gotami. The infidels whom Brahma had to curse were taunted and abused in the flowery language of India, and they were threatened with all the punishments of heaven and earth. So the procession moved along a winding path, quite far below the hideout of the little caravan. Lord Lister had discovered a narrow chasm through which he could survey the path. From here he followed every movement down there with keen eyes. He clearly saw how the procession moved more and more westwards at a fairly rapid pace, soon disappearing behind the rocky masses. A sigh of relief escaped his lips and he spoke, rising quickly. "Saved. But now we must go out to get the treasure today." When the word saved came from Lister's lips, great joy had seized all, but this joy was tempered by what followed. The brave Englishman, Kaisargotami, in particular, raised her hands imploringly. But Lord Lister spoke with a cheerful smile. "Now that we have seen that the ground is secure, there is no reason to delay any longer. So, forward, to the treasure of the Siwa." Chapter 5. The Roof of the Treasure. The pagoda of Niagara lay in deep rest. It was night. The moonlight shone upon the grand lines of the temple, drawing them in a gigantic shadow upon the floor. From the dense jungle came a mysterious creak and rustle. This grew stronger and stronger, and at last 2 horsemen emerged from the thicket. When they reached the square in front of the temple, they dismounted and tied their horses to logs. "That is very beneficial. That old friend helps us in our work," said Lord Lister, pointing to the moon. Not a living creature could be seen far and wide. The 2 friends therefore, without taking any caution, walked across the moonlit open square to the entrance of the pagoda. The experiences of the previous night had taught them that they could enter the temple only through the door. They had taken all kinds of tools from their saddlebags. A crowbar was put against the lock of the door and dull blows rang out. White figure emerged from the darkness. It was an Indian armed to the teeth. Nimble as a cat, he crept up to the corner of the temple to see what was happening there. His black eyes sparkled under the white hood of his burnous. The dark brown face was twisted with anger, so that the white teeth shone between the narrow lips. He crouched down to the ground, and suddenly he leveled his rifle, which was richly adorned with mother-of-pearl and precious stones. A shot rang out and the bullet flew past Charlie's head. At the same moment the 2 friends ceased their work, taking up their rifles with lightning speed. Lord Lister had seen the treacherous white burnous and hastened after him, but the Indian had already fled into the dark undergrowth behind the temple. "Hey! A merry hunt!" cried Lister to his friend, and together they rushed after the fugitive. The Indian, however, seemed to have disappeared. Suddenly Lord Lister saw something white appear beside a thick tree trunk. He was about to rush forward when another shot rang out. In the same instant he had thrown himself flat on the ground and the bullet whistled over him without doing any damage. He sped forward, but a shot rang out behind him. A second Indian, who had been watching inside the temple, had come out at the rumor and fired his rifle at the nearest Charlie. This bullet also missed its target. Charlie turned quickly and saw the figure still disappearing into the undergrowth. He now devoted his whole attention to his friend again, and hastened to extend his helpful hand. Lord Lister had pushed forward fearlessly and seized the Indian who had shot at him. His fist clasped the colored man's neck like an iron screw. He reached into his girdle and drew out a long Indian knife to plunge into his enemy's chest. It was a terrible struggle. The Indian's eyes popped out of his head, and foam was on his lips. He had freed his right arm and wanted to thrust. At the last moment, however, Lord Lister succeeded in seizing the hand which held the knife. He wrested it from his opponent and hurled it far away. Then he lowered his fist with terrible force upon the skull of the Indian. A dull cry and the stricken fell at his feet. Meanwhile Charlie had arrived on the scene of the battle and was now helping to bind his friend, the unconscious Indian. The weapons which he had in his belt, as well as his rifle, they took from him, and then they dragged the man into the temple. "Even if he wanted to kill us, he was doing no more than his duty, and he did not deserve to be mauled by wild beasts here," said the Lord to his friend. "Where could the second fellow have gone?" Charlie asked. "He must have fled when he saw that his comrade had come to a bad end. That could have unpleasant consequences for us." "How do you mean that?" "If he informs the whole tribe, and especially the priests, we are lost." "But Charlie, how can he summon help so soon? When the people come, we will be safe with the treasure long ago." Both friends, meanwhile, had once more searched the recess of the temple, without being able to discover a trace of the second watchman. So they now returned to the building to look for the treasure. The pagoda, arched in shape, contained a heavy gold statue of the god Siwa. This is the third god of the Indians. Before this golden statue stood a stone sacrificial altar. Drums, Would our work have been for nothing? Surely there is no treasure hidden here. That good fellow there, who seems to be made of solid gold, we shall hardly be able to move, let alone take him with us. Edward, if we asked the guard. Then he wouldn't betray us, interrupted Lord Lister. He looked inquiringly at the Indian, who lay handcuffed on the ground. The man had regained consciousness. Raffles thought for a moment and then spoke. Now, we can try. Approaching the handcuffed, he said. Would you tell us where you have hidden the treasure of the Rajah's widow? A hostile look flashed from the manacled's eyes, and he gritted his teeth. Charlie and Raffles exchanged a quick glance. The latter seized the long Indian knife with which the colored man had just killed him, placed it on the prisoner's breast, and said, "If you don't tell me the place now, I'll strike." The Indian's face was contorted with anger. "Dog, strike. You will never extract from me a confession which might offend the holy Siwa." Lister put down the knife and spoke in English. "We have to help ourselves if we want to reach the goal. Come on, Charlie, let's see if this old gentleman doesn't have the treasure." With these words, he smiled and pointed to the seated statue of the gods. Together they now tried to push aside the heavy image. When the handcuffed Indian saw what the two friends were about to do, a cry of anger escaped his lips. "Robbers, will you keep off the sanctuary with your cursed fingers? The great Siwa will punish you." "He might be right about that," laughed Raffles, "for if this golden lord falls over it might cost us a few ribs." The cry of anger from the Indian had proved to the two friends that they were on the right track, and they bravely continued their work. The statue was extraordinarily heavy, but we finally managed to get it off its place. When the idol had been slid about a third of its stone base, a valve appeared in it, which could be lifted by means of an iron ring. This was impossible, however, as long as the heavy image, even if it was partial, was on it. So there was nothing left for them but to remove it altogether. The two friends finally succeeded in getting the idol off its pedestal. However, as it floated freely in the air, it began to falter. Charlie had to jump to the side, and with a mighty thud the statue slammed against the wall. When the Indian saw the image of his holy god Siwa fall down, he gave a cry of horror. He thought that now the wrath of the god would crush the temple and the violators of the sanctuary. But nothing of the sort happened. Only the outstretched arm of the god had broken off in the fall and fell to the floor. John Raffles had picked up the broken arm and examined it closely. He clearly saw that the statue was really solid gold. Laughing, he bowed before the idol and said, "We thank you, great Siwa, for giving us your golden arm. We would have preferred the head, for it has more value of gold. But we must be satisfied." With these words he put the golden arm in a sack which had been brought with him to carry the treasure. Charlie meanwhile had examined the idol more closely and said to his friend, "Edward, I believe that the good gentleman's head is not only more valuable because of the greater store of gold, but that it conceals a more precious treasure. Look what glow emanates from that eye." Raffles shone the light of his flashlight upwards, and was amazed at the glorious gleam emanating from the idol's right eye. It consisted of a ruby of priceless value and unprecedented size. "You are right, Charlie, that is a jewel of fabulous beauty and immeasurable value. It would be a shame if we left it here, and I think the old gentleman will see enough with one eye, for the other stone does not seem to me worth taking." With the help of the tools brought along, the stone was soon loosened. The anger and anguish of the Indian now seemed to be reaching its limits. His eyes widened unnaturally, his veins swelled into thick cords in his desperate effort to free himself, and he cried incessantly, "Holy Brahma, protect us! The eye! The eye!" While Raffles was still loosening the stone, Charlie had lifted the flap in the pedestal. When the two friends threw the light of their lanterns into the opening, it sparkled and glittered before their eyes. Millions of sparks seemed to shine against them. It was an immeasurable treasure of precious stones, gold and silver coins, which was hidden there. At the sudden ignition of the electric lamps, the captive Indian was terrified. His face showed great fear. He seemed to take this totally strange and incomprehensible device for an invention of the devil, and perhaps the two friends for allies of the latter. In a short time the invaders had packed the whole treasure in the sack they had brought with them and wrapped it in two linen pouches. After this work was done, they slammed the valve. Charlie looked at the defaced idol and asked, "Shall we not put the statue back in its place?" "But, dude, we need our powers more than we can expend them in this way. Let God stand there. Then the priests immediately understand that their inheritance is lost. Lord Lister had turned to the prisoner with a laugh, and said, "My friend, don't let time fall on you too long. For your own safety we have to close the door and leave you in the dark." With looks full of hatred, the Indian looked at his opponent and muttered, "Go now, ye Christian dogs, the vengeance of Brahma will soon be upon you. I will rejoice when your entrails are thrown before the wild beasts. Your accursed fingers will be cut off because you stole the wondrous eye of the holy Siwa, and your tongues will be plucked because you mock a god." The two friends disregarded the Indian's threats and left the temple, slamming the door shut. When they approached the place where they had tied their horses, they were in for an unpleasant surprise. The little grey stallion Raffles had ridden was gone. Apparently the second guard had stolen the animal in order to get help faster. Now great caution and haste were advised, if the two friends were not to get into precarious circumstances. "That is a bad case," said Lord Lister, his brow clouded. They both understood that one little horse could not carry two horsemen and the heavy treasure. Quickly resolved, the Lord spoke. "Come on, Charlie, on the horse. I'll run after it as soon as I can." Charlie wanted to argue, but Lord Lister continued. "It is better that you ride the horse first, for you are lighter than I. After all, we can exchange later. And now move forward, because time is precious. The Indian has gained a lot of time with our horse and we will lose without much time. I have not the slightest inclination, however, to wait for our friend's threats to be realized, for I will have many a good glass of wine pass over my tongue." Lord Lister's imperturbably good humor soon made the pain of the situation forget, and the little horse, laden with the rich treasures of the Raja, soon trotted merrily forward, while Lord Lister strove to keep pace with the rapid pace of the beast. Chapter 6. The Snake Charmer. Barely half a mile from the temple was the place where the Lord's attendants were left to wait with the young woman for the end of the perilous expedition. Though Lord Lister had tried to keep pace with the trotting horse, more than half an hour had elapsed before they reached the encampment, for the ground had not been level throughout. With loud jubilation the two Englishmen were greeted as they arrived at the first twilight. Kaisa Gautami, in particular, could scarcely find enough words to express her joy at seeing her two saviors, whose lives she had so much feared, safe again. Charlie showed the rich treasures. Kaisa Gautami was overjoyed. But when Raffles took the precious ruby from his wallet, she paled and uttered a cry of horror. The Indian servants, who were also eagerly gazing at the treasures, prostrated themselves, beat their fists on their chests, and seemed to be beside themselves with fright. Raffles did not know what to make of all this and asked Kaisa Gautami the cause of her dismay. The latter then explained to him that the ruby, the eye of the idol, was a miraculous relic, deeply venerated by the Brahmins. The theft of the treasure, even the robbery of the arm of gold, was not so bad as taking this precious thing, which, because of its miraculous effect, could not be replaced. Kaisa Gautami would not be reassured, for she claimed that this stone must bring misfortune to them all, because the priests would not rest until they had regained the miraculous eye. Raffles laughed at these words and finally managed to change the Indian's mind too. Kaisa Gautami begged him to keep all the treasure. The great unknown, however, replied, "Certainly, I am ready to keep the treasure for you until we find an opportunity to look after your future in Bombay or Mangalore." Deep sorrow was written on the face of the young widow when she heard these words. She explained to Raffles that it was impossible for her to remain in the Indies. She told with great conviction, citing various examples, that henceforth she would no longer be sure of her life for a moment, for she was sure that sooner or later she would be kidnapped anyway, and after horrific tortures she would be burned to death. To Price. With moving words she begged Lister to take further pity on her. "Very well, my lady, if you wish. But as we have come to India on another mission, I can only accede to your request if you are willing to experience all the journeys and face all the dangers that may yet await us. That which we have to do here concerns the fortunes of two women in London, who, like you, actually have Indian blood in their veins. When our mission has been accomplished, I will gladly take you to those two women, who will surely greet you with joy and take your fate with heart." Kaisa Gautami willingly agreed to these terms, and from that moment belonged to the Lord's caravan. The great unknown, however, did not seem entirely satisfied. He paced back and forth with a serious look on his face. His friend Charlie went to him and questioned him about the cause of his gloomy mood, and Lister explained it to him. At first it was undeniable that the continuation of the journey would not be hastened by the presence of a lady. Originally the caravan had possessed only 3 camels and 2 horses, so that the increase in the number of travelers necessitated an extension of the means of transport. Now one of the horses had also been stolen by the keeper of the temple. Only 4 mounts in a number of 6 people that could be fatal for all, especially because one had to take into account that the Brahmins would pursue the robbers of the sacred treasure and one therefore had to be prepared for a quick flight. It was therefore necessary to look for new means of transport. But how and where? Walking up and down, Raffles had come to the narrow mouth of the cleft where the caravan rested. There lay cross-legged Nyaniloka, one of the Lord's Indian servants. He had produced a small whistle from his lumber apron and was now eliciting strange, drawn-out sounds from it. Lord Lister had stopped and watched the Indian's strange behavior. As he approached he asked, "What are you doing over there?" Nyaniloka made no answer, but pointed with his eyes to the undergrowth that surrounded the mouth of the rocky gorge. There was a strange rustling, and suddenly Raffles, to his horror, saw the head of a gigantic cobra appear. With small jerks, the body also followed. The hideous monster stretched and began to move to and fro in time with the melancholy melody which the Indian produced from his instrument. Raffles had not yet recovered from his initial fright when a new noise on the other side of the undergrowth caught his attention. The sound grew stronger and suddenly the head of a cobra showed up there too. Quickly followed the long body, which raised itself on the tail and performed the rhythmic movements in time with the other serpent. "But Nyaniloka, are you insane, then, to draw upon us those dreadful beasts?" The Indian answered nothing, but shook his head almost imperceptibly. The little Barbary stallion, which had been tethered at the back of the den, seemed to be watching the reptiles. He soared high with his nostrils flaring and his anxious neighing echoed far away. At this moment Charlie came rushing down from his natural lookout, which was on the top left of a boulder, and shouted, "For God's sake, Edward, the persecutors approach." He had seen in the distance approaching a band of Indians armed to the teeth, at the head of which rode 3 priests in their gaudy oriental robes, and a mendicant in his yellow kaftan, who seemed to lead the whole band. Nyaniloka, holding the flute in his left hand, and playing the strange monotonous melody incessantly, had stripped off his outer garments with his right hand, so that now he wore only a lumber apron and the indispensable turban. Now he got up slowly, stepped out a few paces, crouched down again, and so forced the reptiles to remain outside the cave as well. The stamping, snorting, and anxious neighing of the Barbary stallion had, if possible, increased. Madly, the horse tugged at the rope with which it was tied. A single glance convinced Raffles of the cause. A third giant serpent, enticed by the sounds of the Indian, had crept out of a cleft of the rock near the horse's stand, and was approaching the mouth of the cave with the greatest speed. The horse reared in a frenzy and tried to crush the hideous foe with its hooves. It was a strange scene which presented itself to the eyes of the appalled spectators. The great serpent did not seem to take the slightest notice of its surroundings. Her eyes glowed fervently, and only that one wish seemed to inspire the beast, to come closer to the music as quickly as possible. Raffles convinced himself that the pack of pursuers was approaching at breakneck speed. The 3 camels trembled for fear of the serpents, and huddled silently in a corner. Although the servant and Charlie tried their best to calm the horse, they were unable to do so. Raffles clearly saw the great danger. If the pursuers came so close that they could hear the horses kicking and neighing, it meant certain death for all of them. Those thoughts raced through his brain at lightning speed. There was only one way to salvation: the horse had to be sacrificed. However heavy this new loss was for the travelers, there was no other choice left. There was no longer a moment's hesitation, and so Raffles decided, even with a sad heart, to kill the animal. He would rather have knocked it down with a bullet, but the bang would no doubt have put the pursuers on the track, and so he had no choice but to kill the animal in a silent manner. He seized the long Indian knife which he had taken from the watchman of the temple in the night, and plunged it into the horse's neck, cutting the artery. A great stream of blood came forth, and with a growl the beast collapsed. This swift action, which, admittedly, brought the caravan into new difficulties, seemed for the moment to have a better chance of rescue. And it was high time, for already the first pursuers reached the bend in the road where the cave was. Everyone waited in breathless suspense for the further course of events. Lord Lister, who was hidden behind a bush close to the exit of the cave, saw a horrible scene just before him. The third great cobra, which had frightened the now slain Barbary horse, sat high in the middle of the path, and raised its head just above the crouched Indian's head, so that he was now surrounded by the three gigantic monsters. The mendicant who rode at the head of the procession had noticed the serpent charmer. He turned to the others and pointed to the group. The horses were slowed down, and with a general murmur, "Ah, a saint!" all bowed respectfully upon the backs of their mounts, arms outstretched, and then rode on at a full trot in pursuit of their foes. Only now did Raffles understand what faithful Nyunati had meant. The Indian knew that he would be regarded as a charmer of sacred serpents, and had therefore ventured the dangerous trade with the terrible beasts. When the enemies were out of sight, he rose, beckoned the others not to follow him, and walked slowly, without interrupting his game for a moment, to a distant grove. The snakes, who seemed completely hypnotized by the music, followed him with rhythmic movements in the same tempo. Charlie, from his hiding place, had watched the whole scene in horror, and now turning to Raffles, he spoke. "The faithful Nyunati risked his life for us. How will he himself now free himself from those dangerous monsters? Shouldn't we come to his aid?" "Don't worry, my boy. He will now lure the snakes to a remote place by means of his music, then move away as quickly as possible, and the music suddenly breaks off. The reptiles are still completely impressed by the sounds and are still harmless for quite some time. To reach Mangalore as soon as possible. How we shall succeed in this I do not yet know. As for 6 persons, the baggage and the treasure, we have only 3 camels at our disposal." Hassan, the Mohammedan servant of the Lord, approached his master and said, "Sidi, Hassan knows what to do." When we moved into this shelter, Hassan noticed not far from here within an enclosure an elephant belonging to a Hindu. Perhaps Sidi could get hold of it. But he is evil, that elephant, for Hassan saw that the Hindu was preparing him for the much. John Raffles, to whom the meaning of the word was not clear, inquired about it, and Hassan explained to him that elephants could be trained for war by feeding them only sugar and butter for 4 years. This method of dressage is called much, and some Indians rear captive elephants in this manner in order to obtain a higher price for them than for the common working animals. "All right then, Hassan, we'll see if we can get the animal from the owner." Hassan pushed his turban aside and scratched his head with a shy grin. "Yes, but, Sidi, who will drive the half-wild elephant? Hassan can't." Lord Lister, recognizing the correctness of this remark, turned to the third servant, and inquired whether he had driven elephants before. "Oh yes, my lord, Ananda has often sat on the mighty's neck to guide him." The lord set out with the 2 servants as soon as possible to seek the owner of the elephant. However, this one was nowhere to be found, and so Raffles simply decided, even without the owner's permission, to take possession of the magnificent mount. However, as it was contrary to Lord Lister's noble character to take anything from a poor man, he filled a pouch with gold and silver pieces, fastened it to the end of one of the ropes by which the elephant had been bound, and covered it with a layer of sand to hide it from the eyes of unauthorized persons. The elephant was still young and therefore, fortunately for the travelers, only prepared for the much for a short time. He showed himself to be quite good-natured, and willingly allowed himself to be carried away by the Indian, who had mounted on the neck of the great beast. They soon set out to reach the encampment. Lord Lister, who was walking beside the elephant, chanced to look back and saw Hassan, who had lagged a little behind, busy getting out of his hiding place the bag containing the purchase price for the elephant. "Hassan, quick thief, what are you doing there? Do you ever want to keep your thief fingers at home?" he called to him. Hassan, terrified at hearing these words, slipped on the damp floor and, looking at Lord Lister with unhappy face, said, "Hassan just wanted to see if the nice money is well hidden." Raffles laughed aloud at the unfortunate figure, who cut Hassan and cried, in good humor, "I hope you have now convinced yourself that your concern was unnecessary. Now forward." Hassan followed his master, hands deep in the pockets of his wide trousers, taking one last farewell look at the unattainable treasure. Returning to the camp, preparations were hastily made for the further flight. Kaisargotami and Charlie were placed on the elephant's back, while the Indian driver sat on the animal's neck. Raffles, Hassan, and Nyunati, the snake charmer, who had also returned, mounted the 3 camels. Meanwhile the last shadows of the night had receded, and in the bright sunshine the caravan sped through the forest. Raffles intended to reach the outer harbour of Mangalore by the shortest route, without passing through the city itself. Not a single peculiarity occurred and soon the coast was reached. A Hindu, returning from his nightly catch of fish, had tied his boat to a boulder jutting out from the coast and was transferring his catch onto a low cart to ride into town accompanied by two naked, tall boys. John Raffles, who arrived first, dismounted and looked for an opportunity to cross. Suddenly he heard a loud cry behind him. It was Charlie, who saw with his sharp eyes a troop of horsemen emerging from the forest. There was no doubt that these were the Brahmins who pursued them, for the bright morning light shone on the yellow kaftan of the mendicant. Before them the roaring sea, behind them the band of enemies. No rescue seemed possible. Lord Lister, who surveyed the perilous situation with lightning speed, had already made his plan. The fisherman's little sailboat was the only way out open to them. It was impossible to imagine entering into battle with the much stronger foe. Calmly and clearly, John Raffles gave his orders. The luggage, and above all the rich treasure of the Rajah, was quickly stowed in the vessel. All had descended from their high seats at lightning speed. It was just in time, for the first bullets of the persecutors were already whistling through the air. Kaisa Gotami, who was nearly unconscious with fear and horror, was brought into the boat first by Charlie. Hassan had already unhooked the craft and was holding the pole with his muscular hands, so that he might be able to push the boat off at once when all were aboard. Meantime, at Raffles's command, the other two servants had gathered slender twigs, bound them into a bundle, and fastened them to the elephant's tail. Then they jumped into the boat. They lit the twig. The elephant, half enraged with fright and pain, gave a deafening roar and galloped toward the Brahmins. The three camels had looked up in surprise. When they saw the burning bundle at the elephant's tail, they cried out in terror and ran after the pachyderm. The four rushing animals had in a few moments thrown the procession of the Brahmins into utter disorder. The horses reared up, and several of them galloped landward with their riders. The elephant, whose fury grew ever greater, swung his trunk back and forth, making noises that seemed to come from hell. One of the pursuers' horses, a grey Barbary stallion, reared so high before the raging elephant that he fell backward and buried his rider, one of the priests, beneath him. The elephant furiously kicked the fallen horse. He picked up the priest with his giant teeth and threw him on high. The others watched in horror as their companion was flung into the air like a ball, and then crashed with great force to the rocky bottom. Only a formless, bloody mass of him remained. All the others now fled with deafening screams. No one thought of persecution anymore, and so the rescued could reach the wide sea unhindered in their fishing boat. Chapter 7. On the lonely island. A fairly strong southeasterly wind blew across the Arabian Sea and drove the refugee vessel toward the Lake Dev archipelago. The Indian servants, who had become almost senseless with terror at the attack of the Brahma priests and their armed men, now breathed again, and Kaisa Gotami breathed a sigh of relief. Charlie and the Mohammedan servant, Hassan, operated the peculiar, almost square sail that was on the fisherman's boat. Raffles, steering with skill, called out to his friend Charlie. "We have to try to keep going west. As far as I know, there are dangerous reefs and sandbanks to the north of the islands. Besides, I believe that the wind turns." Raffles' comment was correct. The wind was now due south, imperceptibly driving the craft northward. To keep an accurate course, as they had only a pocket compass belonging to Lord Lister. Some other valuable instruments, which might have served them well, had been left behind in the hasty flight in the sack that hung on the elephant's back. The situation became increasingly critical. 6 people and the rather bulky luggage were already too much for the small boat. Now the occupants also had to fight against wind and waves. In addition, the sun burned mercilessly and did not make staying in the boat any more pleasant. The wind blew into the sail and drove the craft ahead. The white crests, which splashed to the right and left of the boat, brought a soothing cooling. Thus they had been drifting about for a few hours when narrow, dark stripes became visible in the distance. "Country!" cried Charlie. Lord Lister, however, shrugged his shoulders and tried to determine the direction with a small compass, then shook his head thoughtfully and said, "I'm almost afraid we've gone off course and are approaching the Sesotris bank." It soon turned out that he was right. It was only with the effort of all their might that they managed to get aground on the dangerous bank. However, this unpleasant incident had something good, because it was now possible to agree on the direction. It was soon possible to refloat the vessel. Making their way southwest, the navigators soon reached their goal. The journey from Mangalore to Chibanyani was nearly 2 hours delayed, so that the sun was almost disappearing on the horizon by the time they reached the archipelago. From the clue Raffles had found in the mysterious ring, he was forced to assume that the treasure he sought was on the small northeastern island. The adventure he had just lived through also made him understand what the last marks on the strip of parchment meant. This was a warning to the Sesotries Bank. However small these islands are, almost all of them are inhabited. The Lake Dive group has nearly 15,000 inhabitants, mainly Arabs. Coming from the northeast, Lord Lister's sharp eyes had spotted a small bend. He persisted and soon the craft landed safely in this small natural harbor. The adventure of the early morning had made the fishing boat in the full sense of the word a lifeboat for the travelers, and they knew how to value it. As it was not possible to know for the moment what the return from the island would be like, the greatest care was taken to salvage the vessel. The servants pulled it all up to the bank, which was fairly flat here. 2 stakes were driven into the ground, and the boat fastened to them. Having now for the first time since several hours solid ground under one's feet, they first began to prepare a resting place. Packs of luggage were piled to the seaside and blankets spread. Thus, at least for Kaisargotami, a somewhat sheltered bed was made. The Indians, meanwhile, had collected dry wood, twigs, and all sorts of combustible objects, and made a fire from them in a pit. A supper was soon prepared from the provisions brought along, which tasted excellent to all after the exertions of the day. After the meal was over, Raffles prepared to explore the interior of the island. He took only Tall Hassan with him, while Charlie and the 2 Indian servants remained behind to protect Kaisargotami and the luggage. Raffles had hung his excellent rifle, revolver and knife in his belt. Hassan was also equipped with weapons, and both walked on with quick steps, hoping, if possible before nightfall, to find a house in which to settle. Can stay overnight. However, all their searches were in vain. The island seemed to be deserted. Apart from a few monkeys, which jumped merrily about in the trees and looked curiously at the 2 walkers, not a living creature was to be seen. Despondently, Raffles finally had to decide to take the way back. The thought of Kaisargotami and the necessity of letting her spend the night in the open made him gloomy. Such a forced stay in the wild was not so bad for the men, but Kaisargotami visibly suffered from the constant fatigues and vicissitudes. This was already the 3rd night that she had no rest and no place to sleep. When Raffles, on his return, informed her that it had not been possible to find a place to live, she smiled. "Oh, don't worry about me. I want to live like my saviors and desire nothing better." A hut was built from chests with the aid of a few short tree trunks and sheltered from the sea wind by overlaid blankets. Here in Kaisargotami would pass the night. The servants took turns keeping watch during the night. The fire was kept to keep away any wild animals that might be on the island. After everything had been arranged in this way, they surrendered to the well-deserved rest. Chapter 8. The Vow. A dilapidated building rises in the middle of a dense forest. It is one of those Indian giant temples, which have been serving Buddha for ages, and in which the Brahma priests hold their mysterious services, surrounded by oracles and mysteries, ruling princes and nations. The temple has often been the scene of savage battles, which have damaged the appearance of the building, but which have not taken away its claim of sanctity. Built like a pyramid, it has 3 floors, 50 towers, displaying the same colossal face of Buddha on all 4 sides, make an unforgettable impression on the beholder. Stairs play a major role in all Indian temples. They are on the outside of the walls and bear, besides various other ornaments, a large store of stone animals. The builders of these great giants of earlier ages intended to make the temples seem even higher than they already are. As you go up, the steps of the stairs get higher and narrower. The temple contains 3 gates, surmounted by tower facades, which have no spire and which are richly decorated. Between them extends a gallery 250 meters long, supported by several pillars, and which surrounds the whole building. The main entrance is guarded by the gigantic stone statue representing a serpent with 7 heads, called Naga. Not far from this great building, on a meadow, is the sala. Such is the name of the refuge for itinerant priests, which is not lacking in any Buddhist village. Many priests have been preaching and teaching throughout the land since ancient times. If necessary, the sala also serves as a refuge for other travelers, if they are satisfied with it, because the sala is very primitively furnished. Resting on stilts, made of reed and palm leaves, without doors or windows, it is really nothing more than a bare waiting room. This building had now been converted into a hospital, for the people who had been wounded in the pursuit of the robbers had been laid there. Also the remains of the unfortunate Buddha priest, who had been crushed by Raffles's elephant, had been wrapped by the others in the yellow robe of the mendicant, and there temporarily buried. A surgeon, who was quickly fetched, attended to the wounded, aided by a Buddhist. The others made their way to the temple in silence, with grave, gloomy faces. In front were two brothers with flaming torches, followed by a mendicant and, finally, the host of priests and scholars. The soldiers who had accompanied the pursuers lined up in front of the temple, while the procession of priests halted in the great hall of the building. In the center of this is a statue of Buddha of gigantic proportions. The great head of the idol reaches almost to the second gallery, and the surface of the pedestal is 90 square meters. In the room there are 4 small altars, at which the pilgrims pray and to which the people from the surrounding area go on pilgrimage. The torches were lit at these altars, and burning torches were also fixed all around, along the columns that surrounded the giant hall. It was a scene full of strange, mysterious charm. The space shrouded in darkness, in the midst of which enthroned the mighty Buddha, round about the flaming torches, which cast their red, uncertain, and ghostly light over the richly carved columns. Before the Buddha statue the priests were crouched in a large circle. Softly they murmured their mantras. A priest, with snow-white hair and a long, flowing beard, stepped forward and bowed 3 times with outstretched arms before the image of the deity. He then turned to the crowd and told all, though they knew the events accurately, again what the foreign invaders, Raffles and Charlie, had done. When he spoke of the wondrous eye of the god Siwa, they all prostrated themselves on their faces, beat their breasts with their fists, and tore out their hair. The grizzled Buddha priest now turned to a Brahmin scholar and asked what punishment the robbers should receive according to the sacred laws. The man stood up, bowed 3 times before the idol, according to the custom, and then said, "The Buddhists are taught to exercise the same patience, goodness and brotherly love towards all men without distinction. Does not the saint also teach, who is unable to develop his mind and will never reach nirvana?" Again the scholar bowed and said, "Thus spake the Buddha, the murderers of father, mother, and holy arahats, because or mendicants, those who create strife, those who dare to insult Buddha, and those who are too sensual, shall not be admitted to nirvana. Do we know states of pain into which they will enter?" "Yes, wise father." The priest beckoned and the scholar went back to his place. 6 fakirs now again engaged in one of their savage dances as they revolved around the image of the Buddha, uttering loud cries and wounding their bodies with knives. During this ceremony the others sat perfectly still, muttering spells and prayers incessantly. After about half an hour the fakirs were so exhausted that they collapsed, uttering only low, plaintive noises. Now the grey priest arose again and spoke to the crowd. "Now you know what punishment awaits the infidels who have violated the most holy. Buddha looks down on us and demands from us revenge for the sacrilege. We are chosen to protect Brahma and we must therefore act. As prescribed in our sacred teachings, we shall have to recapture the treasure, the wondrous eye of Siwa. Who of you will fulfill this sacred duty?" At this question of the priest, all arose from their places in a sign that none of them wished to remain behind. The old man nodded in satisfaction, and then selected 2 younger priests, giving the mendicant the lead. The 3 chosen ones were now to strip off their clothes and prostrate themselves naked before the image of Buddha. Then the grey priest approached and anointed the heads of each of them with consecrated oil. Then the men stood up and crossed their arms. The priest drilled 3 needles into each of their upper arm muscles. The Indians underwent this without batting an eyelid. Meanwhile the fakirs had begun to dance again, circling the 3 chosen ones amid loud shouting. Now the priest mounted the pedestal of the Buddha statue and pronounced a vow on that spot, which was repeated by the trio. "Lord of the world, you see into our hearts, for you are the omniscient. We swear to follow the robbers through lands and seas, over your mountains and abysses, and not to rest till we have found the wondrous eye of holy Siwa. None of us will ever be saved, and your nirvana will remain closed to us until we fulfill our vow." After all three had repeated these words, the priest descended again from the Buddha statue and said, "The King of Truth has heard your vow. I know you will keep it, for the longing for a life in heaven will spur you on and guide your steps, so that you will soon have fulfilled your holy calling." The three chosen were anointed a second time with holy oil, and only then did the priest pull the needles out of their arm muscles. Putting on their clothes again, the men took their places in the circle with the others, and again the fakirs began their religious, exciting, wild dances. Then all prostrated once more before the Buddha image, and the old priest murmured holy prayers. With that the action was over. In solemn procession, as they had come, the participants left the temple to return to the cellar. The wounded, meanwhile, had already been carried to the nearest village, and the remains of the unfortunate priest, who had met such a dreadful end at the hands of the taunted, savage elephant, had also been sent there for interment. As this was a member of the Pali tribe, this interment was of a very special nature. It is forbidden in Pali to defile the elements, fire, water, earth, and air. Therefore they must not bury their dead, nor burn them, nor cast them into the sea. Therefore they have erected large buildings, very similar to an ancient Roman amphitheatre. Provided with water supply on four sides, it consists of a circular space, in which stands the statue of the goddess of death. From there run in irradiating 8 corridors, and between them the naked corpses are deposited. In the smallest circle, close to the idol, lie the corpses of children, followed by the corpses of women and girls, and finally, at the end, the corpses of men. In this open space the corpses lie until the vultures have devoured the flesh and the sun has bleached the bones and reduced them to dust. Such a funeral ceremony is always a great feast for the whole village, from which no one stays away. This time there was no time for the three chosen to participate in the ceremony, for a sacred duty called them. The mendicant was in charge of the expedition, and he immediately took his measures because action had to be taken as quickly as possible. It had been seen that the fugitives had made their way to the archipelago of the Lake Dives. It was evident that they would not be able to make a great journey in the little fishing boat. One might therefore hope to find them still in the vicinity of these islands. A number of stout men were selected from the body of warriors and were to accompany the three on their pursuit. They dared not, however, travel by night, and now the whole procession proceeded to the port of Mangalore to put to sea at daybreak. It was a picturesque scene as the band of Indians moved through the narrow mountain passes by the bright light of the moon. Brightly shone in the soft moonlight the barrels of the guns, the lances, the knives, and the daggers, and the brown faces showed great determination to capture the robbers of the sacred treasure, even at the cost of their own lives. Chapter 9. Raffles as a washing woman. In the east, the sky began to clear. The shadows of the night gave way to the beneficent rays of the sun, and nature awoke from her slumber. Lord Lister was the first to leave his bed just as the sun was rising over the sea. The undisturbed night's sleep had given him new strength, and he breathed in the fresh, invigorating sea air. Then he went to Ananda, who was on the last watch of the night, and asked him if there had been anything unusual during the night. Ananda answered in the negative, and Raffles began to make preparations for the exploration of the island. He spread a map on the floor in front of him and took from his breast pocket a small strip of parchment on which were inscribed the mysterious characters. 70.5 degrees, 12.2 degrees Mangalore 3 crosses 13.1 degrees. As he carefully compared these statements with the map, he murmured with satisfaction, "I couldn't have been wrong. Here I must find the treasure and finally unlock the secret of the ring." Charlie Brand, who had also awakened in the meantime and had refreshed himself by a sea bath at some distance, came up to his friend, wishing him a gaily good morning. "Charlie, I firmly believe that we shall soon have reached our goal. The 3 crosses before 13.1 degrees are a warning for the Sesostris Bank, and 70.5 degrees, 12.2 degrees Mangalore apparently points to Chibanyani. Here must be found the treasure which Ellen's father, the Indian prince, has buried, and which that rogue Blakehorst would steal from the poor orphan. Ah, Edward, I should be glad if we could hand over to the 2 women her property. What would Blakehorst say if he knew how near we are to the treasure for which he has piled crime upon crime for a lifetime? Well, it wouldn't please him, anyway. but don't believe that he won't find out. As soon as we are safe and sound in London, I inform him that we have delivered the treasure to its rightful owners. I wouldn't do that in your place, Edward, for the wicked one will certainly make things difficult for the poor women. Leave that to me. I shall know how to protect the women, and besides I think to give the villain such a memento that any thought of vengeance will be far from him. My first work after our return will be to get rid of the other human devils with him, and to rid society of those hyenas. At the memory of the crimes which Raffles had discovered traces in the dens of the cursed creatures, his anger overpowered him, and he faced Charlie like a god of vengeance. Hassan, Lord Leicester's Turkish servant, was awakened, and, taking the place of a cook, prepared breakfast. Kaisar Gautami also soon appeared, and some time later the whole company was sitting in the merriest mood on the coast of Chibanyani, having a splendid view of the Arabian Sea. It was a glorious morning, not a cloud on the horizon. A gentle southwest wind rippled the waves, which were a beautiful dark blue. Dark streaks loomed in the sea to the south and west, those were the neighboring islands. Charlie Brand, who was leaning his back against a fig tree, was just about to put a slice of bread filled with preserved meat to his mouth, when he suddenly received a violent blow to his right arm. The bread fell to the ground, and a brown creature threw itself upon the bread in the midst of the company. Kaisar Gautami had let out a low cry and Raffles had jumped up. The two Indians ate quietly, however, and looked at the others with a merry grin. With a great leap the brown intruder had scrambled up the trunk of the fig tree, bread in his mouth, and a few moments later had already disappeared among the leaves. It was a monkey about 3 feet long, who had probably been lured by the tasty bits and now wanted to see what valuables the strangers had down there. In any case, he didn't seem to like the loot, because suddenly the sandwich came down and fell right into a chocolate-filled cup that Raffles was holding. The cup wobbled and the brown liquid flowed over the white burnous that Raffles wore, coloring it with whimsical figures. A curse sounded from Leicester's lips. The rest of the party, who had already burst into laughter at the theft of the bread, now laughed so heartily that he had no choice but to agree. He went to where the waves washed the beach and tried to wash away the brown stains with seawater. And now Raffles had to confess that he knew nothing of the practical abilities of a housewife, for the seawater prepared him an unpleasant surprise. The chocolate color faded a bit, but all kinds of other stains appeared in the white fabric and Raffles regretfully saw the brightness of his beautiful burnous disappear. Charlie Brand, looking from his seat at his friend's work, laughed loudly and exclaimed, "Edward, I should like to take a picture of you and send a printout with the caption, 'Raffles as a washerwoman to our good Inspector Baxter at Scotland Yard.'" Lord Leicester was delighted with this funny idea of his friend, and finally gave up his efforts, which he saw as futile. They were preparing for the journey. Raffles and Charlie were now accompanied by Ananda, while Kaisar Gautami remained behind, protected by the other Indian servant and the faithful Hassan, who meanwhile would prepare the midday meal. The three walkers turned in an easterly direction, because Raffles thought he should understand this from the statements on the parchment. The vegetation is very luxuriant on the islands of the Arabian Sea. Dense forests and vast, fertile fields cover the land. The walkers often had difficulty making their way through the dense undergrowth. Suddenly they came upon a small clearing, around which the Niagara trees formed an almost equilateral triangle. "I firmly believe that we have reached the right place, here we shall dig." Lord Leicester, who had looked carefully about and compared the position of the trees with the mysterious indications of the note, spoke with great determination. The little triangle on the parchment could only refer to the triangle formed by the trees. They were about to start working the ground with picks and shovels that Ananda had brought with him, when Charlie beckoned his friend. Not far from the place where the treasure diggers sought their refuge, a small hut, built of logs and leaves, arose, which seemed to partially disappear into the ground. Lord Leicester immediately ordered Ananda to stop his work and all three went to the building. Raffles had reached the entrance first. Everything was still, nothing moved. So he decided to enter the cabin through the low door. However, this was not harmless, because what would the house contain? If it was inhabited, an enemy might have lived here. If it were not, the danger seemed even greater, for it might be the habitat of some beast of prey. Raffles therefore kept his Browning pistol ready while he lit his electric flashlight. Through years of use the bottom had flared out in stages and Lord Leicester could go down very easily. He had taken a few steps when a soft moan and unintelligible muttered words reached his ear. For a moment he hesitated, but then descending further, he let the light fall into the dark room, where in one corner he discerned a huddled brown figure. It was an old fakir, clad only in a loincloth, who sat in the dark corner on the damp floor. The body had shrunk to a skeleton, not a single member moved and only the lips murmured monotonous prayers and spells. The bright light of the electric lamp blinded the old man's eyes. He closed them involuntarily, and then pointed them at the stranger with an expression of astonishment. In a low voice the fakir asked, "What do the infidels want at Bimbisara?" Lord Lister, seeing that he was dealing with a dying man, leaned over the man and made the feeble drink wine from his canteen. The Indian, however, refused and said, "Do you not know that it is forbidden for the believers to drink wine? Bimbisara needs nothing. His body will die, but he will be admitted into nirvana." Inquiring further, Raffles learned that the fakir had lived on the island for over 50 years. He had been appointed by Simha, by whom he evidently meant an Indian prince, as a guard over a treasure, which he was to guard until the king's descendants should one day claim him. These words, spoken with difficulty, were occasionally interrupted by prayers. He begged Buddha to release him from his service, otherwise he would not enter nirvana. Raffles had listened with great interest to the confused story of the old man. Involuntarily it occurred to him that there must be some connection between his mission and the dying man, and so he decided to tell the old man what had driven him here. When he heard the history of the ring, his life-light seemed to flicker again, and Lord Lister showed him the parchment, reading to him the mysterious characters. After he had finished speaking, the Indian nodded his head and offered a prayer of thanksgiving to Buddha. Thereupon he spoke. "I see that your mission is genuine and honest. The Lord has guided your steps here that Bimbisara may return to nirvana in peace. Bring to the daughter of my friend Simha what is her property. 1,000 paces from here to the west you will find a broken column. This stands in front of the entrance to a cave in which the treasure is located." Excited, Raffles asked, "Do you speak the truth?" "Bimbisara is a believer. Believers always speak the truth." The Indian had straightened up proudly at those words. Now he slowly collapsed again and spoke in a low voice. "Listen further, stranger. Bimbisara has hidden the treasure there. That no unauthorized person should find him, he has set watchmen over it, who guard it well. Death and destruction lurk there. Thou, however, thou shalt." A shock shuddered through the body of the fakir, the head sank on the chest and the heart had ceased to beat. Death had overtaken the faithful guard before he had been able to give a sufficient explanation. "We'll leave the poor fellow here and go." When the trio stood again in the bright sunlight, Lord Lister spoke. "In any case we must be grateful to brave Bimbisara for sparing us the trouble of useless searching and showing us the way. Too bad he couldn't complete his warning. We now know, however, that dangers await us at the broken column, and we will try to avoid them." The trio continued on their way to the spot indicated by the fakir. Chapter 10. In the Scorpion's Hollow. They had scarcely gone 600 or 700 paces in the direction indicated, when they saw a pillar, the top of which had been broken off. This must have been done long ago, for thick undergrowth had hidden the fallen part, and it was with difficulty that Raffles could read what was carved into the stone. It was a verse which summarizes in a few words the Buddha's teachings, and which is said to have come from himself. Raffles translated. "Shunning all crimes, exercise of good. Purification of the senses. That is the aim of Buddha." "Beautiful thoughts," said Charlie thoughtfully. "Certainly, my boy. If only words and deeds were not always so at odds," replied John Raffles mockingly. Just behind the column there appeared a height, bordered by great stones. At the top, a kind of crater formed a narrow entrance, while at the front, close to the height, there was a hole. Both openings were barely big enough for a man to pass through. Raffles examined the cave intently. What could this contain? Of what nature were the guards to whom the fakir had entrusted the treasure? Would snakes live here or maybe a tiger? Charlie and the servant stood at some distance with weapons ready, while Raffles cautiously climbed the height. When he reached the top, he leaned cautiously over the opening and looked inside. There was nothing to see or hear. As he took out his electric flashlight and let the light fall down, Raffles listened with tense attention. A strange rustling was heard from the depths, and with a cry of horror Lord Lister sped backward. The bright light of the lantern had disturbed the inhabitants of the cave. A few large black scorpions clambered down the cliffs. Now Raffles knew the secret of the lair. It was inhabited by scorpions, this hideous species of spider, whose sting is rightly feared, for it brings irrevocable death. Indeed, the fakir could not have better guarded the treasure, for who would ever venture to enter this cave? Raffles quickly made up his mind. He knew that scorpions go out to prey only at night, fearfully avoiding fire or light. He built his plan on that knowledge. Started collecting dry wood, twigs and other flammable substances. Small bunches were tied together and placed in a circle around the den. Flammable material was also placed on the other hole, which served as an entrance. Ananda had been sent back to the encampment on the beach and just returned with oil and grease. Raffles poured this upon the faggots which formed a rampart about the exit, and then he himself ascended the hill with a great faggot soaked in oil. After lighting it, he threw it into the opening and put burning wood on top. Almost at the same time, Charlie and Ananda had set fire to the whole rampart, and the crag was now engulfed in a blaze of fire. The effect would not be long in coming. The scorpions, about 50 or 60, rushed out of the hole. The light blinded them and exasperated their fury to the utmost. They did their best to discover their enemies and kill them with their sting. But in vain, wherever they turned, fire everywhere. The animals were seen running around distraught. Some tried to flee the burning prison by force, but they were killed by fire. Others, seeing the way out barred everywhere, turned back to the cave, where the heat and light were least troublesome. Here they circled a few more times and then stabbed themselves with the poisoned sting in the head or back. Lord Lister had counted on this peculiarity of his terrible foe, and he had succeeded. A quarter of an hour later all the scorpions lay burnt, or killed by their own venom, on the ground. Now the way was clear. The entrance was quickly widened with picks and shovels. Penetrating deeper, Raffles found a soft layer of earth, and presently he was able to produce 2 iron chests, which on closer inspection contained an almost immeasurable hoard of gold, silver, and precious stones. As the chests were very heavy, part of the contents was taken from each and these valuables were placed in a sack that had been carried along, in order to evenly distribute the burden for the 3 treasure hunters. On the way back to the camp one had to pass the fakir's hut again. Raffles stepped inside once more. The dead man lay still and peaceful. Poor Bimbisara. For 50 years you have guarded an immeasurable treasure and now you have died in misery. You will have a proper burial, however, before we leave Chabaniani, muttered Raffles, and was about to leave the hut when he discovered a parcel on the floor. Closer inspection revealed that it contained a full costume of a Hindu girl. A long outer garment with countless pleats and a head covering surrounded by veils. Probably a Hindu beauty had come to the canonized fakir and ordered her to pass through the country as a penitent. At the same time she would probably have put off her rich outer garment in this place. Thinking that this dress might also be of use, for example for Kaisar Gautami, Raffles took the package and followed the others to the camp. Chapter 11. Happy Escape. When the 3 treasure hunters returned to the camp, they were all in great excitement. Kaisar Gautami in particular was trembling with nervousness. 2 boats had been seen approaching the archipelago, and Kaisar Gautami claimed that they certainly contained the priests and the soldiers who were on the trail of the fugitives. Hassan, too, stated that he had clearly seen the mendicant's yellow kaftan in the foremost boat. In order not to cause a stir, the fugitives had remained quiet in their encampment. The boat was hidden behind the thick trunks of the sala trees and had therefore not been noticed by the pursuers. Hassan had crept up to a small height to take a look. From there he saw that the 2 boats had landed on the opposite side of the island. The camp waited with feverish impatience for Raffles to return. When he heard what new danger was looming, in his usual calm, sensible manner he immediately made a plan for flight. He had the boat prepared again for sailing, for he understood that there was no other way out for them than the open sea. He then ordered that all baggage, and especially rich treasures, be carefully stowed away. I will go and see where the enemies are, and hold them back if necessary, until you find time to do all my bidding. But, Edward, what do you want to do? You are frivolously risking your life and putting us all in the greatest danger, for what shall we do if you do not return in time? Let me go, dear Charlie. You stay here and make sure everything is ready for departure when I get back. I trust in my good stars and I am sure that it will not leave me this time either. A smile crossed Lord Leicester's face, and a cunning twitch crossed his mouth. It seemed as if he had suddenly had a happy thought. Quickly he had opened the parcel which he had brought from the fakir's hut and taken out the garments. He wrapped himself in the wide, pleated robe, put on the headgear, and deftly concealed his moustache with the veil. Greeting the others with his hand, John Raffles went into the interior of the island, and no one would have recognized the pretty Hindu girl as the treasure hunter. If the situation had not been so serious, those left behind would certainly have laughed heartily. But now the question came to everyone: will the plan of the brave young man succeed? Under Charlie's direction, Lord Leicester's orders were followed punctually. The boat was launched and made ready for sailing. The luggage and chests with valuables were stored in the hold. All waited with feverish impatience for Raffles' return. In vain. A quarter of an hour passed after another, but neither Raffles nor the pursuers were traced. With all that, the wind had shifted. From the southeast a strong breeze blew over the sea and made the boat of the fugitives dance on the water, so that in addition to the chain with which it was fastened, a rope was needed. For some time now a grey cloud had appeared on the horizon, rapidly increasing in size. Now it had already grown into a black wall of clouds, growing still larger and approaching with alarming speed. The wind grew stronger and stronger, and strong gusts swept over the island, sometimes with such force that the tops of the trees swayed to and fro. With a worried face, Charlie looked now at the forest from which his friend had to return, and now at the frighteningly beautiful spectacle presented by the sea. Faithful Hassan stood half in the water at the pole to which the boat's chain was tied. Around him the waves roared and boiled, soaking him through the weekend. He, however, bravely defied them, yet gazed longingly at the dark forest. The two Indian servants were in the boat, waiting for further orders. Care and fear were written on their faces, for they knew that all sorts of dangers lay in wait for them and that perhaps the next minute could bring death. Kaisa Gotami had taken a seat in the middle of the boat. She did not mind that the high foaming waves soaked her clothes to the skin. Her large eyes stared at the island with a feverish gleam, as if to pierce the deep darkness of the forest. Her lips murmured incessant fervent prayers for the success of Lord Leicester's perilous enterprise. The nervous tension had become unbearable. Charlie couldn't stand it any longer. He told Hassan his plan in a few words and rushed into the forest. Meanwhile the southeast wind grew into a gale. He whipped up the waves so that they beat furiously on the beach, covering everything with their white foam. He shook the trees back and forth, so that they creaked, and countless branches, broken by the violence of the storm, fell into the undergrowth. Charlie had gone perhaps 300 paces when he was delighted to see something white twilight between the trees. It was the light robe that Raffles wore as a Hindu girl. Raffles came running as fast as he could and, as they returned to the ship together, he related his experiences to his friend. He would have had to penetrate farther than the spot where the broken column stood before he discovered anything of the pursuers. The mendicant who was in charge of the troop noticed the Hindu girl first. As the forest in that place was very dense, and the storm carried thick black clouds with it, it had been easy for Raffles to pass his disguise as real. When asked by the mendicant where she came from, the Hindu girl had related that she had been with the fakir, who was a scholar. This was immediately believed. John Raffles now went on to say that the fakir had died. As he was informed, on a question put to him, that he had not noticed any foreigners, the pursuers first went to the hut of the fakir to look at him. This moment had been used by Raffles to disappear into the dark forest in order to find his comrades again. When the long-lost man was seen approaching with Charlie, a sigh of relief came from all lips. The great unknown cried from afar, "Ready to sail." But Hassan pointed to the raging sea, shook his head sadly and said, "It's not working, Sidi. If we go out, the sea will swallow us up. And if we stay here, the persecutors will kill us. At sea we may be able to escape happily, here a certain death awaits us. So go ahead." At these words, Raffles jumped into the boat and cut the rope by which the vessel was tied. Hassan had already untied the chain and jumped into the boat, which was now hopping like a deer over the white waves. The brave sailors had a hard battle with storms and waves. Again and again they were thrown back on the beach, until at last they succeeded in reaching the high seas. As Raffles was now more at home in the fairways than when they came, they skillfully sidestepped the perilous banks, heading in a northwesterly direction. Their flight, however, had been noticed on the island, for now the two boats of the pursuers were clearly seen sailing away from the island. Now a life and death hunt began, which became all the more dangerous as the storm grew fiercer from minute to minute. Pitch-black clouds covered the sky, thunder and lightning followed one another. In such weather, of course, there was no question of staying on course. Raffles had allowed the sail to be hauled in, rowing was out of the question, and so the vessel, like a plaything of the elements, floated about on the sea. By the light of the lightning, Raffles saw that the two enemy boats were sailing close behind each other. Another flash of lightning showed him that the foremost boat lay completely on its side. Raffles knew what this meant. The pursuers were stranded on the sandbar. They had thus escaped, at least for the moment, the danger of being murdered by the fanatical priests. But would they not become a prey of the raging waves? After about 2 hours the storm had subsided, the sky had cleared and the sun was shining brightly. The wind must have turned, for soon the bold navigators saw land looming. Raffles believed they would land near Mangalore. However, when they entered a port about an hour later, he learned to his great surprise that they were in the port of Karwar. Only now did they realize the great danger in which they had been. The boat had covered the great distance from Chibanyani to Karwar at breakneck speed. At Karwar, Raffles was delighted to find a steamer, which the next morning set out for the Mediterranean. On landing at Karwar, Kaisar Gautami begged Raffles to return the ruby, the wondrous eye of the god Siwa, to its owners. She painted with vivid words the dangers that Raffles had created by appropriating this very stone. Knowing her countryman, she informed him that some priests would certainly be sent to pursue him to the utmost. Raffles, however, did not listen to this. He replied laughing, "Let them search with all their scholars, they will not find the stone. And the Indians will not pursue me as far as London." But Kaisar Gautami spoke in a concerned tone. "Thou knowest not the persistence of the Indian, you know not the value of his oaths. He seeks the wondrous eye, though he should circumnavigate the globe, and he will find it. Oh, if you would but listen to my words." Charlie, too, was frightened by the anguished words of the beautiful widow, and begged his friend to leave behind the precious stone. Lister, however, firmly refused, saying, "You know I don't keep that stone for its value, but just because you think it might put me in danger, I keep it, for did you ever see Raffles fear danger?" Charlie was powerless against this argument, and he spoke no more of the Siwa's wondrous eye. Kaisar Gautami, too, saw that she could not convince the lord, and kept silent. Raffles discharged the two Indian servants with rich gifts in Karwar, while he set out for the homeland with Charlie, Kaisar Gautami, and Hassan. The rescued spent the night in a hotel at Karwar, but only when the next morning the steamer that was to take them back to their homeland weighed anchor did they breathe again, for only then were they safe from the pursuit of the Indians. Kaisar Gautami, however, could not be unconstrainedly cheerful, for she shuddered when she thought of the vengeance of the Indian priests. When the ship was already approaching the East Indies shores, Charlie spoke to his friend, who sat beside him on deck. "Would friend Baxter be glad to hear from us again soon in London?" Raffles made no reply, but an eloquent smile crossed his face as he blew the smoke of his cigarette into the clear morning air. The next number, 25, will contain the bank director. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.